Election interference, meddling with Canadian democracy. That is the #1 hot-button political issue these days because people want to know, did the Chinese government muck around trying to get the Liberals elected? What did the Liberals do about it once they realized there was a problem? And specifically, should there be a public inquiry into foreign interference in Canadian elections? That's the big question that will continue to be asked even after the man whose job it is to decide that very question said this yesterday.
The intelligence I have reviewed is and must remain secret. As a result, the reality is any credible public inquiry would not be public at all.
And that pretty much sums up his point of view after months of investigation. David Johnston, the former Governor General and now the special rapporteur appointed by the Prime Minister to investigate this issue, he says there should be no public inquiry into allegations of foreign election interference. And that means there likely won't be one, because the government has resisted the idea of a public inquiry all along and said it would only hold one if David Johnston recommended it, which we now know he does not.
I committed to listening very carefully and abiding by the recommendations that the former Governor General made. We will be following his recommendations.
So what did Johnston's investigation find? Can we trust his conclusions? What is he proposing that would be useful? And how exactly did this all start anyway? Like, why is Canada suddenly so consumed with the idea that our elections may have been compromised?
Explosive allegations about how and who China used to interfere in Canada's federal elections.
Growing calls for a public inquiry into Beijing's attempts to meddle in the past 2 federal elections.
Sources say a clandestine election interference network was covertly funded by Chinese state entities in the 2019 federal election.
It was only once media reports began to surface that China had meddled specifically in the 2019 and 2021 elections that this story really began to pick up steam.
Han Dong announced last night in the House of Commons that he is leaving the Liberal caucus. That decision following a Global News report yesterday, which alleged Dong advised a Chinese diplomat against Beijing's releasing of the 2 Michaels.
Han Dong, according to sources, was one of at least 11 Toronto area candidates allegedly supported by the Chinese government in the 2019 election.
It cited top-secret CSIS documents detailing Beijing's sophisticated strategy to influence the 2021 election.
In one case, unnamed sources told Global News that a Liberal MP, Han Dong, urged a Chinese diplomat to hold off on releasing 2 Canadian prisoners because that might benefit the Conservatives.
What has been reported is false, and I will defend myself against these absolutely untrue claims.
Dong denies this, but left the Liberal caucus, vowing to clear his name, and he's suing Global. Separately, the Globe and Mail reported that a Conservative MP was targeted by the Chinese government, a sort of victim of a smear campaign to make him lose his race. And Globe sources also said that the Chinese government did have a preferred election outcome, Liberal minority. So, on the question of whether there was interference,
Foreign governments are undoubtedly attempting to influence candidates and voters in Canada.
but Johnston didn't really get more specific than that, kind of just warning people not to think that they've got the whole picture when they might only have a tiny piece of the puzzle.
Each piece of intelligence is a brushstroke to paint a broader picture. Only upon seeing the full picture, with the benefit of all relevant intelligence, can one conclude that much of the reported intelligence has been misconstrued in media reports, presumably because of this lack of context in these instances.
So in his mind, you can't arrive at any real understanding of foreign interference with just the bits and pieces that we've seen. He called it a look what I found, flawed approach to evidence. But he says, basically, he's seen things. He has something approximating the full picture. He has access to classified information. So his conclusions, one, that we, the public, have a pretty skewed version of foreign interference, because we've only been getting dribs and drabs of evidence from sources and from the media.
When viewed in full context with all of the relevant intelligence, several leaked materials that raised legitimate questions turn out to have been misconstrued in some media reporting, presumably because of the lack of this context.
2, that there was no evidence the government ignored intel or failed to act on intel.
I have found no examples of ministers, the Prime Minister, or their offices knowingly or negligently failing to act on intelligence, advice, or recommendations on the issues I have investigated related to the 2019 and 2021 elections.
3, the 2019 and 2021 elections were well protected, and there's no basis on which to lack confidence in the results.
Fortunately, measures put in place by our governments have been largely successful. The elections of 2019 and 2021 were well protected by sophisticated mechanisms.
And I should point out, even the Globe's own reporting suggested this was true. But the 4th thing that Johnston says, there's a reason all the intelligence he's seen is secret. And that's why there shouldn't be a public inquiry. Because the thinking goes, you either have an inquiry that spills all the beans, which irreparably harms Canada's national security interest, or all the secret stuff stays secret, and you end up with an inquiry that's been so watered down as to be entirely useless and maybe a little bit harmful.
A couple of parliamentary committees are looking into this. There are other investigations and processes going on. If you add all that up, I am not convinced that on top of all of that, an independent inquiry would really give us much more than what we're already going to get.
But here's the thing. This is all asking an awful lot of Canadians, isn't it? Like, Johnston is basically saying, trust me. You know, I've done the work. I've found no clear evidence of serious wrongdoing, and anything you would want to know, you're not going to get in a public inquiry. So let's just all try to move forward. Cool? Cool. Well, let's spend a little time talking about why it's not that simple.
When he says that there would be duplication of effort because he's already done the work and that it has to be done quickly, well, perhaps if he had called a public, independent public inquiry 2 months ago, that would have resolved the problem.
We remain resolute that a public inquiry is necessary to restore the confidence in our electoral system, to make sure we're showing Canadians that this is something we take seriously.
We don't trust David Johnston to do public hearings because he is a family friend, cottage neighbor, and ski buddy of the Prime Minister. He's also part of the Trudeau Foundation.
All 3 main opposition parties are in agreement. There needs to be a public inquiry. And Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has been very consistent on this line of attack, that anything and everything Johnston concludes is suspect because of his ties to the Trudeau family. First, that they're ski buddies.
My friendship with the current Prime Minister was based only on a few skiing expeditions with my children.
Johnston says his family and Trudeau's family skied 5 times when Justin Trudeau was a child, that the families had residences about 50 kilometers away, and that besides being a principal of the university Justin Trudeau attended as a student, had virtually nothing to do with him.
In that period of time, until he became a Liberal member of Parliament and I was Governor General, I had no meetings with Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Justin Trudeau. I had no letters that I can recall, no telephone calls.
I saw him a few times as a kid. I got to know him after he was appointed Governor General by Stephen Harper, once I was already a parliamentarian. And quite frankly, the quality and the caliber, not just of his decades of extraordinary service to this country, but the quality and caliber of the report he's put forward leaves me in total confidence in his ability to continue to do this important work.
But what about the fact that Johnston sat on an advisory committee of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, even made donations to it?
It's incredible that he didn't even mention the Trudeau Foundation in his report, even though publicly available intelligence showed that the dictatorship in Beijing had given money to the Trudeau Foundation.
Well, Johnston defended himself on that front as well, saying he was interested in scholarship foundations of all types and that his donations to the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation in particular amounted to less than 1% of all charitable donations that he and his wife made. And we should say, all of this is setting aside the fact that David Johnston was first appointed as Governor General by a conservative Prime Minister, Stephen Harper. But in the eyes of the official opposition, no amount of explaining removes the stain that David Johnston fundamentally is compromised.
He has no business in this job because it is a fake job that he is incapable of doing impartially. And none of his recommendations can be taken seriously because he's in a conflict of interest.
So where does that leave us? Well, we're not quite done here, because while Johnston has said no to a full-blown public inquiry, he does think there should be some kind of public hearing. Now, it might not have access to the same kinds of sensitive classified information we've been talking about, but it could be a way to clear the air. And maybe more importantly, he's urging lawmakers not to just take his word for it. He's encouraged the leaders of all political parties to join NSICOP, which is the National Security and Intelligence Committee.
I recommend the Prime Minister invite the two oversight committees on national security, NSICOP and INSIRA, to review my conclusions and provide them with all supporting materials, including an annex which contains the classified information. If they disagree with my conclusions, they should say that.
But it's not so simple there either, because Pierre Poilievre refuses to join.
As for any proposals he might have to silence me, the answer is no, I will not be silenced. Thank you.
Will you be joining NSICOP?
No.
So to be clear here, he doesn't want access to the specific classified documents David Johnston has seen, because seeing those things means being sworn to secrecy on those things. And from a political standpoint, Poilievre wants to say things.
We're not going to allow the government to silence leaders of the opposition by swearing them to secrecy.
And all of this ignores that the report David Johnston is supposed to file on what we've just discussed is only his interim report. He plans to spend the next several months investigating the communication breakdown between intelligence services and elected officials. He says he wants to strengthen intelligence oversight committees, and he wants to see if there's a way to more proactively declassify information so that Canadians can get the transparency that they've been asking for. Johnston's term as special rapporteur ends in October, which means this ain't over. Expect to see more opposition demands for a public inquiry, more criticism of Johnston's credibility, and more questions to which there are very few truly satisfying answers. We'll be right back.